When the first snow falls, most people think of quiet mornings, warm lights, and peaceful nights. But every winter, right when the world turns white, some of the darkest encounters begin. These are the stories that never made the news, the ones shared online, whispered between friends, or written by people who still don't understand what they experienced. Tonight, you'll hear 6 true first snow horror stories from those who faced something hiding behind the cold. Turn down the lights, and whatever you do, don't trust the first snowfall. The first snow that year came almost a month early. That alone wouldn't have bothered me, but the night it fell was the night everything in our little hiking group went wrong. We had planned a simple weekend trip. Just 4 friends trying to squeeze in one last fall adventure before winter fully settled in across Montana. But what came down from the sky that night wasn't a normal snowstorm. It didn't look right. It didn't sound right. And by the next morning, only I was left. We reached the old fire lookout around dusk, the kind that hasn't been used in decades, but still stands strong thanks to stubborn old lumber. The place had no insulation, barely had a door, and creaked whenever the wind shifted. Still, it was shelter. We set up inside, made a small fire in the old metal stove, and settled in for the night. Outside, the sky was thick with dark clouds that looked heavy enough to burst. We joked about beating the snowfall by just a few hours. But the snow started much earlier than we expected. And it came down so quietly that we didn't even notice at first. Around midnight, I woke up. I'm not sure why. The others were asleep, breathing steadily. The fire in the stove had burned down to glowing coals, and the world outside the thin wooden walls was absolutely silent. So quiet it felt like sound itself had been muffled. I walked to the window, wiped the fogged glass with my sleeve, and looked out. Everything was white. Completely white. A thick layer of snow had already buried the ground, the rocks, the trees, everything except the narrow clearing around the lookout itself. It looked untouched, like no wind had blown and no creature had crossed it. Except something had. Leading away from the steps of the lookout were footprints. At first, my tired brain tried to believe they were ours, but they weren't. They were spaced too far apart and too deep to belong to any of us. And each left print had a second faint outline right behind it, like something stepped exactly where the first foot had landed, but a beat too slow. I told myself it had to be an illusion, just weird lighting or drifting snow. But the prints were precise, perfect, almost deliberate. I shook my friends awake. Mark was grumpy, Jenna groaned, and Liam asked if this was a joke. But once they saw the window, none of them argued. Mark grabbed a flashlight, and we stepped out onto the small landing that connected to the wooden stairs. The moment we opened the door, I felt it. The cold wasn't normal. It wasn't the kind of cold that stings your skin. It was the kind that sinks into your bones, like stepping into water that's too deep. The air felt heavier somehow, like it pressed down on your chest. The footprints led straight into the tree line. Maybe it's a moose or something, Liam whispered. though even he didn't sound convinced. Moose don't walk on 2 feet. We followed the trail down the steps, staying close together, our breaths trembling in front of us. The snow was still falling, but slowly. Too slowly, almost like it drifted down in thick flakes that didn't obey gravity. When Mark shined the flashlight ahead, the beam seemed muted, swallowed before it reached the trees. The prints stopped at the first row of pines. But something else started. Behind the final deep footprint, barely visible, was another set of prints. Smaller, shallower, as if something was mirroring the steps but didn't have the weight to fully press into the snow. "What the hell?" Jenna murmured, kneeling beside them. "Are these even human?" Nobody answered her, because those prints weren't shaped like feet at all. They were shaped like elongated hands, and they were warm enough to have melted the snow just slightly around their edges. That's when Jenna screamed. It didn't come from in front of us. It came from behind. We spun around. The lookout was still there. The stairs were still there. But there was a figure standing at the top, silhouetted in the doorway we had left open. A tall, narrow outline. Still. Too still. The snow around the figure wasn't falling normally. It slid upward, drifting in reverse like dust drawn toward a vacuum. We ran back through the trees without thinking. We didn't speak, didn't look behind us. The snow was already filling our footprints as if erasing them. The cold clawed at my lungs. Branches slapped my arms and face. Something moved beside us, shifting, brushing, whispering. By the time I burst into the clearing again, I was alone. The lookout door was hanging off one hinge, swaying gently. Snow was drifting into the room. The footprints we had followed earlier were gone, covered completely. But a new trail of shallow, hand-shaped prints led behind the structure. I didn't follow them. I couldn't. I grabbed my pack, ran down the hill, and didn't stop until dawn began to break through the snow clouds. A search team went out the next day. They never found Mark, Jenna, or Liam. But they did find something else near the lookout. 2 sets of prints, one heavy, one faint, side by side, and both leading deeper into the woods. My old neighbor, Mr. Warner, wasn't the kind of man who scared easily. He'd lived his whole life in northern Vermont, seen storms that buried cars and winds that took down power lines for days. He was the kind of quiet, sturdy old guy who chopped his own firewood well into his 70s and never complained about anything except rising grocery prices. So when he knocked on my door one evening during the first snow of the season, his face pale, his voice shaking, I knew something was wrong. He asked to sit down and talk, said he didn't want to be alone tonight. I made him coffee, and he told me a story that I honestly wish I could forget. I'm sharing it now only because he passed away the following spring, and he made me promise that someone else would know what he saw. According to him, it started late the previous night. The first snow was falling, the kind that comes down soft and steady, building up on the windowsills without much wind. He was just getting ready for bed when he heard something outside. Not footsteps exactly. More like a dragging sound, slow and rhythmic. Like someone pulling a heavy bag through fresh snow. He ignored it at first. Sounds carry strangely in the winter. But then the noise came closer and closer until it was right outside his back porch. That was when he decided to look. He didn't turn on any lights because, as he put it, when you live out here long enough, you learn not to announce yourself. He just pulled aside the kitchen curtain a couple of inches and stared out into the yard. The snow was still falling, but lightly, just enough to blur the edges of things. At first, he didn't see anything. The backyard was empty, white and quiet. But then he realized something was off. The snow by the tree line wasn't flat. It was pushed up in places, forming strange, shallow mounds, like something underneath had brushed against the surface. That's when the dragging sound came again. Not from the woods, this time from directly below the window. He froze. He said his whole body locked up like he'd been hit with cold water. The sound was unmistakable now. Something was moving slowly, deliberately, right beneath the kitchen window. He could hear the snow compressing under its weight. And then something stood up. Not a person, not an animal. He couldn't describe its shape clearly. Like looking at smoke inside fog is how he put it. But he could make out the outline of a tall figure, much taller than a man. It rose from the snow without using its hands, like it just uncoiled upward in one smooth motion. He expected a face, eyes, something identifiable. But there was nothing. No features. Just a faint shimmer, barely visible like heat rising off a road in summer. He said the figure turned its head toward the window anyway, as if it could see him even without eyes. And then the snow around its feet began to lift, not fall, lift, floating upward in soft spirals. The figure stepped back, disappearing slowly into the tree line, each step leaving a deep imprint that filled itself in after a few seconds. When it vanished completely, he thought it was over. But he was wrong. He stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting in his chair with the lights off. Around 3 a.m., the dragging sound returned, circling his house. At one point it paused near his front door, and he swore he heard something brushing against the wood, as if testing it. By dawn, the noise had stopped, but the snow outside held proof. The footprints, if you could even call them that, weren't like anything he recognized. Each one looked like a stretched-out oval, long and narrow, with shallow ridges running across them. And on top of each large print was a second, smaller depression, like something had stepped directly in the same place, but much lighter. When he told me this, his eyes watered, not from emotion, but from the lingering fear. He said he felt watched the whole day, like something was just beyond the tree line waiting for the sun to go down again. I asked him why he hadn't called the police or anyone else. He shook his head. What would I tell them? That the snow was walking around my house? The thing is, I didn't believe him at first. It sounded impossible. But then he showed me something. He pulled out an old flip phone, he never upgraded to smartphones, and played a recording. At first, all I heard was wind, then a scraping sound, slow, rhythmic, and then something else, something like a low, hollow hum, deep enough to feel in your ribs. That's what I heard, he whispered. All night. I didn't sleep well after that. Every winter since, I find myself listening during the first snowfall, waiting for some sound I hope I never hear. And though I never told anyone else in town, a few months after Mr. Warner passed, I heard a rumor from one of the local rangers. He said they found strange tracks near the stream behind Warner's property. Long, narrow, paired, and the snow around them was melted, just slightly, like something warm had stood there. The first snow of last year arrived on a night when I was alone in my family's cabin. I wasn't supposed to be there by myself. My parents had planned to come up for a long weekend, but my dad caught the flu last minute. I told them I'd make the drive anyway, just to check the place before the real winter storms rolled in. The cabin sat deep in the woods of northern Idaho, near a frozen lake that barely got sunlight in the colder months. It was peaceful in the fall and unsettling in winter. That night, I learned just how unsettling. The snow started falling around 9 p.m. I just finished stacking firewood inside and making myself a late dinner. The moment the first flakes hit the roof, everything became incredibly quiet, like the world had been wrapped in cotton. I didn't even hear the usual creaking of the trees bending in the wind. I stepped outside for a moment, just to look. The snow was thick but slow, drifting down like tiny feathers. The ground was already whitening. My breath came out in soft clouds that seemed to hang longer than normal. The air had a strange, metallic coldness to it, the kind that stings your teeth. I stood there for a few minutes before retreating back inside. Around midnight, I was reading by the wood stove when it happened. A sound outside the window. My first thought was that a branch had fallen, but then it came again, closer. A faint voice, not loud, not clear, more like someone whispering through cupped hands, right beneath the windowsill. I froze in place. The cabin had 3 windows on that side, all low to the ground. The nearest one was barely 3 feet from where I sat. I held my breath and listened. At first, it sounded like the wind was trying to speak. But then I heard it clearly. My name, spoken softly, drawn out, as if someone was lying on the ground under the snow and calling up at me. I set my book down slowly, heart thudding against my ribs. I wasn't tired. I wasn't dreaming. The voice came again, this time longer, like it was trying to mimic my name but couldn't get the rhythm right. I whispered, "Hello?" before I realized how stupid that was. The voice immediately repeated it, my own hello, but distorted, too thin, too breathless, like someone trying to copy a sound they'd never made before. That's when I stood up and backed away from the window. I grabbed the flashlight, pulled on my boots, and stepped outside. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Curiosity, stupidity, or the naive hope that maybe it was just someone lost near the property. The snow was deeper now, up to the middle of my calves. My footprints were the only ones leading from the porch. But around the side of the cabin, under the window, the snow looked disturbed, pushed downward, like something had been lying there. Not an animal. Something larger. The shape wasn't right. Too long, too narrow. As if someone had pressed a blanket over the ground and dragged their fingers underneath it. I scanned the tree line with the flashlight, but the beam felt swallowed by the falling snow. The whole forest looked frozen, unmoving. Then, on the far side of the cabin, I heard the voice again. Only now. It wasn't whispering my name. It was whispering words I had said earlier that evening. Lines from the book I was reading. A request I'd muttered to myself in the kitchen. All of them repeated, stitched together in the wrong order, echoing softly from somewhere near the back wall. I didn't investigate that time. I ran inside, bolted the door, and threw another log into the stove. The voice circled the cabin, passing from window to window. Sometimes it was right against the glass, so close I could hear the faintest vibration in the pane. Other times, it seemed further out, drifting just beyond the tree line. It stopped around 4 a.m., just before the sunless winter dawn. I stayed awake, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to smash through the window. But nothing did. When daylight finally came, the snow around the cabin looked like it had been combed by fingers. Long, shallow trails weaving around the building in looping patterns. Not footprints, nothing human, nothing animal. Just smooth depressions that disappeared a few feet from the cabin walls. I packed my things and drove home that afternoon. My parents thought I was exaggerating when I told them I didn't want to stay there again. I didn't tell them about the voice. I tried to convince myself the whole thing had been a hallucination brought on by stress. Then, 2 weeks later, the first big storm of the season hit. My parents went to the cabin to check the pipes. They called me that night. My dad sounded shaken. He said the snow under one of the windows was disturbed, like something had been lying there. And the weirdest part, he said, is that it looked recent, fresh, as if the snowfall from this morning didn't cover it. I asked him what shape it was. He paused, then said, long, almost like someone stretched out, but not quite human. I told him to come home, and now every time the first snow of the year falls, I hear it again in my memory. The voice beneath the window, whispering the things I never said out loud. I used to work night shifts at a small-town gas station off Highway 219 in Colorado. Middle of nowhere, mountains on all sides, the kind of place where winter hits early and hard. Most nights were dead quiet. Maybe a trucker or two. Sometimes a lost tourist looking for a motel that didn't exist. But there was one guy who stopped by often enough that we all remembered him. Officer Daniel Mercer. Everyone liked Mercer. He'd swing by for coffee and small talk before making another long loop down the highway. He'd tell us about elk blocking the road, or how the snowplows were always late, or how he wished he'd taken a desk job. He was one of those people you just assume will always be around. The night he disappeared started with the first snowfall of the season. Around 11 p.m., the snow began drifting down in slow, heavy flakes, the kind that look almost too big to stay in the air. I was alone behind the counter when Mercer walked in, stomping his boots and brushing off his jacket. He looked tired, but not in the usual way. Something was bothering him. "You all right, officer?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "Saw something strange near mile marker 84. I asked him what he meant. He shook his head. "Probably nothing. Just looked like a person standing on the shoulder. But when I slowed down, they weren't there anymore." I joked about snow ghosts, and he gave a weak smile. But he didn't seem amused. He bought a coffee, nodded goodbye, and headed back into the storm. 20 minutes later, he radioed dispatch to report something in the road. He never said what. He never radioed again. And the next morning, they found his cruiser abandoned with the engine still running, headlights on, pointed straight into the whiteout. I wouldn't know any of this if it weren't for my cousin, who worked in the sheriff's department back then. She pulled me aside a few days later and told me what they found at the scene. First, there were footprints beside the cruiser. At least, that's what they thought at first. But the prints were wrong. Too long, too narrow. Each one had a deeper impression at the heel, like something heavy had leaned back on it. And on top of every print was a second, smaller mark, lighter, as if something else had stepped in the exact same place a moment later. Second, the snow around the cruiser wasn't falling normally. The flakes were drifting upward in spirals like ash rising from a fire, and they kept doing that for hours after the car was shut off. Third, Mercer's final body cam footage didn't match his surroundings. The camera showed the highway at night, snow blowing sideways in the wind. But then a figure appeared on the right side of the road. Tall, thin, facing the cruiser. No details, just a shape, like a shadow against the snow. Mercer stopped the car. You could hear him breathing hard, muttering to himself. Then he opened the door and stepped out. The figure didn't move. Mercer called out. No response. He took a few steps toward it, hand on his flashlight. And that's when it began slipping, literally slipping backward into the snowy dark, not turning, not walking, just gliding away, as if the ground had tilted beneath it. Mercer started running after it. Then the camera cut out. That was the official story. But my cousin told me something else. Something only 3 people supposedly saw. The dash cam footage from the cruiser. Mercer isn't visible. Just the empty highway, snowfall, and the hood of the car. Then something appears at the edge of the frame. Not a person. Not any shape that fits into words. A distortion. A tall warping in the air, like heat rising off asphalt. The snow around it begins to lift upwards. The distortion moves closer to the cruiser, and the camera flickers. For a moment, less than a second, you can see something inside the distortion. Something long, pale, almost like fingers brushing across the lens. Then the footage ends. They never found Mercer. Not his body, not his footprints beyond the car. Nothing. The storm buried everything. The official report blamed whiteout disorientation. Everyone who knew better stayed quiet. But here's the part that haunted me most. 3 nights after Mercer vanished, I closed up the gas station at 2 a.m. and stepped outside to lock the trash bin. The snow wasn't falling, but the air felt sharp and strange. Silent. And when I turned back toward the station, I saw prints in the snow. Not human, not animal. A long line of narrow indentations leading toward the side door, then stopping completely, as if whatever made them simply lifted off the ground. And on top of each one, a second, smaller print, just like the ones near Mercer's cruiser. I quit that job 2 days later. I don't drive Highway 219 anymore. And every year when the first snow comes down, I stay inside. I don't look outside. I don't listen. Because I know some things walk in that snowfall. And some things follow. I wasn't planning to go outside that night. I swear I wasn't. I'd worked a double shift, came home exhausted, made some cheap pasta, and sat down on the couch with the TV on low. The first snow of the year had started falling earlier in the evening, and by midnight, the whole backyard looked like someone had laid a perfectly smooth white sheet over it. Not a single footprint, not a single wind mark, just untouched snow reflecting the porch light. And maybe that's why I noticed it so quickly, the way it moved. It started with a twitch, a tiny pulse near the center of the yard, like something beneath the surface had shifted. Not an animal, not a branch. It was deeper, as if the ground itself had exhaled just enough to lift the snow a fraction of an inch. I turned off the TV to listen. The house felt too quiet, like all the sound had been sucked into the snow outside. Then the twitch happened again, this time longer, stretching outward in a thin line. The snow trembled, shivered, then pushed up from below. I stood and stepped closer to the glass door. That's when the first track formed. It didn't appear, it grew. The snow rose in a small mound, then collapsed in on itself, leaving a long, narrow footprint. Too narrow for a person, too long for an animal. The print looked like someone had dragged a canoe across the yard. Only there were ridges, thin and perfectly spaced, running across the indentation. Before I could even process what I was looking at, another print formed. Then another. Then another. Each one growing from beneath the snow as if something buried deep underground was walking slowly upward, like a diver pushing against the underside of a frozen lake. I should have backed away. I should have called someone. Instead, I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, squinting into the yard. All I saw was snow rising and falling, rising and falling, footprint after footprint, carving themselves toward the house. I don't know how long I watched, maybe 30 seconds, maybe 10 minutes, before my dog started whining at the door. She was a quiet old mutt, not scared of anything, but that night she whimpered like she wanted to melt into the floor. She crawled under the coffee table and wouldn't come out. The tracks kept forming. They split into 2 lines, parallel, advancing, measuring time with each slow depression. I took a step back. The prints were halfway across the yard now. Then I made the mistake of turning off the porch light. The moment I flicked the switch, everything outside went dark. For a heartbeat, I saw nothing. Then the snow lit up with movement. Even in the darkness, the footprints continued forming, each one glowing faintly from inside the snow, pale and bluish, as if lit by moonlight trapped underground. The lines curved toward the house, toward the door I was standing next to. I backed away quickly, nearly tripping on the rug. The dog growled, a low sound I'd never heard from her. The air felt heavy, charged. The house creaked like it was holding its breath. And then everything stopped. The tracks froze in place. The trembling beneath the snow went still. The yard became motionless again, the glow fading out like dying embers. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then the tapping began. Not on the glass, not on the walls, under the floor. A soft, deliberate tapping, like someone knocking politely from beneath the house. The dog howled, bolting down the hallway. My heart hammered so hard I felt dizzy. I didn't dare move. I just listened as the tapping traveled, slowly, from one corner of the house to another. 3 taps. Silence. 3 taps again, always in a different spot. Finally, after what felt like hours, the tapping stopped. I waited another half hour before I even breathed normally. By dawn, the prints were still there in the yard, perfectly aligned, perfectly spaced, leading right up to the bottom step of my porch and stopping. That's what scared me most. They didn't wander, didn't pace. They walked straight to my door. I called a friend from work, someone I trusted not to laugh me off. He came over an hour later, took one look at the prints, and asked what kind of prank I was pulling. But when he stepped into the yard, the snow beneath his boot sank with a strange heaviness. Like there was a pocket of air beneath the surface. He turned pale and stepped back. We shoveled the tracks, trying to erase them. But throughout the day, the depressions kept sinking back into place, no matter how much snow we filled them with. It was like the footprints belonged to the ground itself. By sunset, they were completely restored. And that night, another line of prints formed. Closer this time. Closer every night since. The last snowfall came 3 days ago. I woke up at 3 a.m. and looked outside. The new tracks ended at my bedroom wall. I didn't sleep after that. And I don't think the ground outside is still. Not anymore. The blizzard reached the mountain pass long before anyone realized it wasn't a normal storm. By the time the volunteer search team assembled in the ranger station, the roads had already sealed shut under several feet of white. No plows, no helicopters, no way out. But search teams don't get to cancel their missions just because the weather turns spiteful. Jared Cole, the newest ranger recruit, tightened the straps of his pack and tried to hide how nervous he was. He'd been on the job for barely 3 months. Rescue calls still made his stomach twist, but this one was worse. A missing church group of 12 hikers, all last seen heading toward White Pine Ridge hours before the snow hit. Stay close, keep your radios dry, and don't wander off the trail, Senior Ranger Alvarez reminded them. White Pine does weird things during storms. Sound bounces around. Don't go chasing voices. Jared didn't understand what she meant until much later. They set off into the storm in 2 columns. The snow was coming down so thick that each step erased the footprints of the person in front of him. The trees bent under the weight of ice. Darkness settled early, pressing down on them, even though it was barely afternoon. 2 miles in, the wind picked up, not a howl, but a long, hollow note, almost like someone blowing across the mouth of a bottle. It echoed strangely, repeating itself over and over, shifting direction every time. White Pine wins, Alvarez said. Ignore it. But Jared kept hearing something beneath the wind. Little stuttering hums, rhythmic, faint, almost musical. They found the first body an hour later. A woman knelt in the snow, frozen stiff, her eyes open and lips parted like she'd died mid-prayer. No blood, no signs of struggle, just a peaceful, eerie stillness. A thin layer of frost had formed across her face, sparkling like crushed crystal. One of the senior rescuers whispered, "Why's she kneeling? She should have collapsed." No one had an answer. They flagged the spot and pushed on. Radios crackled, batteries dipped fast in the cold. Something in the storm swallowed their signals, like the mountain itself didn't want them calling for help. Then the humming started again. Closer, clearer. A dozen soft voices humming the same wavering note. The same length, same pitch. Over and over. Jared stopped on the trail. "Do you hear that?" "Don't listen," Alvarez snapped. But her voice shook. They reached a clearing where massive pines circled around a depression in the snow, a natural amphitheater. The sound was louder here, not wind, not any animal. It was human, many humans. A low humming chorus. The search team fanned out. Snow fell so thick that even headlamps lit only a few feet ahead. The humming grew in intensity, vibrating through the air like something alive. "Choir?" Jared whispered. His breath fogged and froze instantly. A figure emerged from the swirling white. A man in a thin jacket, face bleached pale, moving stiffly like a marionette. His mouth hung open, humming the same trembling note. His eyes didn't blink. Another figure stepped behind him. Then 3 more. Then an entire line of them. 12 hikers, the missing church group, standing shoulder to shoulder among the drifting snow. Their faces sagged with exhaustion, yet none of them collapsed. Their lips were blue, their eyes were wide, and they all hummed in perfect unison. The search team froze, horrified. Alvarez finally choked out, "Everyone, step back, slowly." But the choir didn't move toward them. They simply stood there, humming, unblinking, their entire bodies shaking from the cold. Then the storm itself seemed to react. The wind shifted into harmony with their note, deepening it. Thick waves of snow spiraled inward, forming a vortex around the hikers. The ground trembled. One of the rescuers screamed, "They're sinking!" He was right. The snow beneath the hikers began swallowing them like quicksand, inch by inch. None of them fought it. None tried to run. They simply continued humming, even as white powder climbed their legs, their waists, their chests. Jared broke formation and rushed toward them. "Stop!" Alvarez grabbed him, but he tore free, stumbling toward the closest hiker, a teenage girl, barely 16, her lips trembling as the snow reached her shoulders. He grabbed her arm. Her skin was ice hard. Her eyes rolled toward him, and for a split second, the humming faltered. Her mouth twitched like she wanted to speak. Then she whispered, barely audible over the storm, "It wants a choir." Before he could react, a violent blast of wind slammed him backward. He tumbled through the snow, choking, blinded by white. By the time he pushed himself up, the clearing was completely silent. The hikers were gone. Not a single footprint remained. Not a trace of struggle. Just an untouched field of snow, smooth as glass. They never found the hikers. The search team barely made it back alive. Half their equipment failed. Radios died. Some members insisted they still heard the humming following them through the storm, even when the sky cleared. Jared quit 2 days later. He never told anyone what the girl said. Not officially. Not on record. But sometimes, when the first snow of the season starts to fall, he swears he can hear that trembling note again. Faint, hidden inside the wind. Like the storm is still building its choir.